guess by way of background, the uprisings in China, they were triggered by the death of workers and families in a fire in a Foxconn factory in Xinjiang. And basically, China's COVID zero lockdown policy had blocked the entrances of this factory so that when the fire broke out on November 24th, people inside couldn't escape. Firefighters couldn't respond in time. And this was a triggering incident that inflamed protests against COVID zero lockdowns around the country. But the uprising is not really about the COVID lockdown per se. It's like the intersection of COVID lockdown with China's oligarchic economy, right? With what Darren Byler called it like terror capitalism, right? So it's this deeply oppressive situation that workers face in China that has intersected with COVID. And so it's the precarity plus surveillance state that creates this sudden explosion, you know? And America is not like to blame for the CCP surveillance state, but our hands are not clean when it comes to the nightmare conditions that factory workers have to work in, you know? Like Foxconn services the American economy. Like it's a Taiwanese company, you know? And that kind of goes to show you that like identifying good guys and bad guys on the basis of a fucking nation state is going to be misleading, you know? But also Foxconn's business in China, it's assembling electronic parts for iPhones and shit for the US export market. And it's labor repression. It's making fucking slaves out of people that gives China the competitive advantage for Foxconn to be doing their thing in China. Worker protests were already ongoing, right? They had been going on for a month prior. But now everyone in China is united by this kind of suffering under collective COVID zero. So like even normal people, that's terrible. Even like privileged people in China are subjected to the kind of like surveillance and controls that like Uyghurs have to undergo, right? That workers at factories have to undergo. So there's like a common suffering. And that's why this thing is a united protest movement as opposed to the like very localized things that happened before.
If you want further evidence of multinational firms and American companies selling their souls to the Chinese state for profit, I heard that Apple recently issued a new release of its firmware or software, and in China blocked the AirDrop feature, which has been instrumental to sharing photos and locations for the purpose of coordinating protests, which is just, you know, something to be ashamed of. I just really took me aback.
Gosh, I worked in tech when I remember the tech companies, they refused to go into China. And now it's just been a whole shift where they will create this separate internet, right? And there's this whole, I just remember back in the day, was Google going to create a separate search for China and all these various questions, right? But it's so interesting because I appreciate the systems view too, because it calls out like the actual power structures that are at play that are keeping people in these situations. And it's also interesting because it's often rooted in that intersection between corruption and governance, right? And what in theory is very, very basic. And I think what's been interesting about the China protests to me is that they're seemingly, from at least interviews on the street, and obviously a lot of this is anecdotal, but you know, many folks out at the protest, it was like their first time at a protest, right? And that they would go again if people were going to be there. And so it's this really interesting show of solidarity that I'm really glad to see the Chinese American diaspora and Asian American diaspora organizing around this, because they're an incredibly important voice that hasn't been listened to in Washington on China policy at all. And it's important that not only their activism is centered, but the way that they are centering the people in China who are the ones organizing for change is really important and something that's typically rare in Washington analysis.
Yeah, 100%.